All right, everybody, welcome, one and all to a live episode of The Compliance Guy. I am Sean Weiss, and as always, I want to say thank you to each and every single one of you joining us across the spectrum, who are watching us and following us on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and YouTube, and always to those of you who are listening to us on the recorded version. Looking at some of our last numbers, it's actually really exciting to see across the 80 podcast platforms. In just 11 short weeks, we are up over 32,000 views of our podcast, and we are growing, and we thank each and every single one of you. Again, if you enjoy our podcast, please help us spread the word. Our shows are always free, and I always try to have the best and brightest available for you to engage with. We will also be taking live chats today. So if you wish to engage with our expert panel who's joining me today, you can do so through the chat feature, and we will do the best we can to get to your questions, comments, and or concerns. So again, as I say all the time, welcome to the circus where it always remains the same, but the clowns change. And today I have three outstanding folks that are joining me on the show. Stephanie Allard, Paul Spencer, and Scott Kraft. Welcome to each and every single one of you. Thank you for taking time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule for each of you to join in and engage in this conversation. So welcome.
Thank you.
Hello.
So much energy this afternoon on a Friday.
It's Friday. Yeah.
It is Friday. It is Friday. And, you know, I'm excited because it's a weekend. I wish it was a long weekend, but it is a weekend. So, all right, today there is so much going on and so many things for us to talk about. Obviously, yesterday on my blog, the Compliance Guy blog, we talked at great length about the relaunch of the Targeted, Probed, and Educate program. Again, this is a program that was initiated back in 2017 by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They focused on the services with the highest rate of potential problem. And again, this program was in full swing. Scott, Paul, Stephanie, each of you all assisted me in close to 36 different client TPE cases that we were managing and engaging on behalf of our clients. Really interesting. Yesterday, what was produced by Noridian was something that actually said, hey, all previously opened cases tied to the TPE program were now being closed. And for durable medical equipment, irrespective of where the client was or where the organization was at that time, they were going to all restart at level 1. So again, I want to talk just real briefly about the Targeted, Probed, and Educate process. So Paul, because you worked on the majority of these cases with me, and actually I know yesterday you were engaged with one of our big clients out of Florida on this. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of what you're seeing and what some of your guidance has been to the clients that you're working with?
Well, the TPE audits that I've been working with specifically over the last 6 to 7 months with our large client in Florida, as you mentioned, have to do with DME and different types of DME, whether it be back braces or foot and ankle or knee. Some of the biggest problems that we've come into play, the biggest and first thing that we're dealing with is that they're trying to bill customized orthotics when there's very little customization, and that just might be a matter of choosing the wrong L code for the brace in question. But there are also some other issues that we've been dealing with, not so much as far as the coding, but what we're really looking for is the detail of how you get to medical necessity with regard to DME audits. And the biggest barrier seems to be that not only is there inefficient exam findings for things such as knee braces when we're talking about joint laxity, but we're also dealing with just, if you have a centralized billing office and you have decentralized physicians' offices, how that information and how that education is sent to individual locations. So it is hoped that the smaller you are, the easier the path that you have with TPE audits, understanding that they're going to look at your utilization before they really start jumping on top of it. I mean, if you're a high utilizer, chances are you'll fall under the Targeted Probe and Educate program. But the most important thing that you can do before you ever dispense a piece of DME is to understand the coverage guidelines within the LCD in your area that points exactly to what is needed for documentary purposes and when these things are covered. We're also seeing some rather uncomfortable things on the commercial side as well with DME that we're working through, and we'll save that for another show. Yeah, it's been quite the struggle, and the more requests you have, now is the time to get a hold of that process. And seemingly the hardest thing is just getting the requests centralized and
That's right.
just having one process.
Right. And a couple of things that I want to make sure that everybody remembers, because we've been on a hiatus for more than a year. I think it was March of 2020 when they shut down the TPE audit program. So since that time, I know a lot of folks like to put these things out of their mind. And when you do, you oftentimes forget about the requirements of these audits and these programs. One of the most important things to keep in mind is that this is a prepayment review. So when you are issued a request for additional documentation for review, an ADR, they extend to you typically a 45-day window to submit that information back to the TPE program for review. Unlike a post-payment review, there is no statutory allowance for an extension to be able to submit your medical records. Now, obviously, we are still going through a pandemic. Portions of the United States have been hit extremely hard with the most recent hurricane that came through, Hurricane Ida, both down in Louisiana and up through Mississippi, and then as it trudged its way across into Pennsylvania and up into New Jersey, where there was significant flooding. And we pray and hope each and every single one of those folks in those areas are safe and doing well after that experience. But folks, keep this in mind. There is no extension granted. Now, there are 3 levels that you go through with a TPE audit. Again, you go from level 1 to level 2 if you have greater than a 20% error rate. Again, from level 2 to level 3, if you have a 20% error rate or above, you're pushed forward. And then from level 3, if you fail at level 3, there is a referral that is typically made back to the UPIC, the Unified Program Integrity Contractor, for an investigation, and or it could be escalated as far as to the Office of Inspector General if they believe that there are activities of fraud that need a more harsh look. So that's the TPE. Stephanie, I know you've worked with me on some of these TPE projects as well. Anything that you can throw shade to for our listeners today on some of the projects that you were working on?
So my biggest advice would just be to make sure that you are actually implementing changes based on what they were looking at. If you had one of these previously, some of the Macs, I know Novitas is really good about putting information on their website. They call it a documentation checklist. So you can go in and check for yourself and make sure. Actually, you can check your individual documents, but they will also show a list of what it is that they're looking for when they do a TPE. So you can see if the services you render fall within that list, and then from there go to that documentation checklist. But don't think that, it's just gone away. I know Sean and I, we had one client that was going into a third round review. So, okay, maybe that's been dropped, but they've seen things. They know there's errors there. So more than likely, I would think they would circle back around at some point.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Stephanie. Folks that were in level 2 or level 3, just because they're closing those doesn't mean that they're not going to further investigate, right? So those old audits may be closed, but they will most likely go back and pull a whole brand new round of audits for you. And if those same problems exist, you're just right back where you started. So excellent point. Take into account the guidance that you're getting from the nurse auditors at the TPE program. Now, I will tell you, I think Scott, maybe it was you or Paul, we've had so many of these. We adamantly disagreed with a nurse reviewer on one of these calls because we felt that what they were looking at was just incorrect based on what was actually documented by the provider. And as a result, our recourse of action, because they weren't willing to change their review because it was finalized. The only option that we had was to file an appeal. And if the appeal was successful, then it would lower the rate of error. And if we got it below 20%, we didn't have to go to the next level. But folks, keep in mind, you may not always agree with these nurse reviewers. And if you don't, your recourse of action is an appeal through the CMS appeals process. Scott?
One thing I want to add to this, and I realize I'm probably going to sound like Captain Obvious here, but when we think about targeted audits based on utilization, it doesn't necessarily mean, I work with providers all the time where their response to something like this is they're just going to tamp down utilization in certain ways. And I don't necessarily think that's the right answer, but I think regardless of what you're doing, I mean, the services that you render the most, the things you provide the most, those are the areas where you need to focus, like lock it down from a documentation principles perspective. I think, one difference in 2021 is some of the tent poles of these templated examinations in history have gone away, right? And I think, we've now seen, I know I've seen all manner of different history and exam documentation, but to a point that Paul made earlier, there still are certain exam requirements. There are still certain conditional barriers that are met to use certain types of equipment, right? And so if you're doing it a lot, you should assume you're going to be a target. And if you know the target's on your back, then it's incumbent on you to make sure you're doing it correctly and invest that time in the front end. I mean, certainly to Sean's point, nurse reviewers are wrong all the time. You have appeal rights, you challenge those for sure. But I would definitely put some front end emphasis on the high utilization services, because the fact that you are high utilization does not automatically mean that your billing should be suspect for any number of reasons.
I think those are great points. All right. So I think that's a healthy conversation about the targeted, probed, and educate program. Again, I'm still awaiting on some more clarification from my contact at CMS on whether what was released tied to durable medical equipment will apply across the board. Pretty sure it's going to, because that's the guidance that I've been given, but I'm still waiting for somebody at a higher up level to be able to confirm that. We'll see what happens. My expectation is probably in the next 30 to 45 days, you all will probably start seeing, if you're not already seeing, some of the letters coming out indicating that you are now being put into the TPE audit process. So stand by. We'll stay on top of this for you, and we'll make sure to keep you as well informed as possible. So with that said, I really was excited about having Paul, Stephanie, and Scott join the podcast today, because there's so much going on in the world of coding and billing and auditing. And, every day I have the privilege of getting dragged into different meetings with different clients of different specialties, different sizes, and different geographic locations across the entire country, and sometimes into some of the territories of the United States. And part of what, I've been engaged in are issues tied to evaluation and management service documentation, specifically attaching it to the time aspect, the failures of the documentation, the failures to establish the medical decision making, which leads to a failure in the medical necessity, and we're going to address all that. But there's also big issues with infusion because of the COVID pandemic. We're seeing shortages in rheumatology infusion drugs, and as well as other infusion drugs. And there's a lot of questions being asked about, hey, instead of wasting this, can we adjust our wastage to zero? Or can we adjust the dosing down for the patients? And I want to address those as well as incident 2 issues, Scott, that I know that you're continuing to deal with as well with some of the clients that, we're engaging with. So why don't we start with, I think, probably the most enticing of all of these conversations, which I think is the evaluation and management services. So who wants to kick it off?
So I'll jump in. I know you mentioned time. And I have, I was doing a review this morning, actually, and it's something that I've noticed a lot in 2021. So the nice thing about the old time statements and counseling and coordination of care is it was somewhat binary, right? You said you spent more than half of the time counseling and coordination of care, and you could look through the note for snippets of that. Like, I discussed with the patient this, I had to reach out to another provider to make an appointment, right? So I was doing this review this morning before we did this call, and it was indicative of the time attestation I often see now, which is the provider is stating they spent a certain amount of time that aligns with the code. And then they've kind of put a box lunch of everything they could possibly have done that day into that statement. But the note isn't indicative that they did all of those things, right? And so to me, to give you an example of the one that I was working on this morning, the time attestation said across the board that counseling was given to patient/family/caregiver. Now, there was no family involved. There was no caregiver involved. It was stated that the time spent included the ordering of tests and procedures. In a lot of these notes, there were no orders, there were no procedures, right? So the statement said the ordering of medications. In a lot of these encounters, the patient did not get a medication. So, it's a sort of fundamental at the note level. I don't want to overstate it, but it's a fundamental misrepresentation of how the time was spent, because you can't, it's not a grab bag, right? You can't go in and say, here's everything I could have possibly done. The note will reflect that I did some of these things. And part of me wants to say, I think it is, most of us would agree that the documentation burden from a requirements level in 2021 is lower. We don't have all these tent pole things we have to do in history and exam. I think you for better or worse, documentation is supposed to be an accurate representation of the service that was rendered. And if you're going to claim you spent a certain amount of time, that time allocation should be a pretty pristine and accurate reflection of how it was spent on a specific patient.
Well, I'd like to jump in here too. I mean,
Please.
One of the biggest issues that we had, or that we had in pre-2021 outpatient E&M services, is dealing with templates. I mean, we had the 95 guidelines, and we still, reminder that we still do in every other site of service, but we had these templates that were basically built to satisfy a level of service. And that is a failure of the electronic medical record companies to present it like that. And then what occurred after that was training on these EMRs, where it was a very vanilla training for 2 weeks. And then unless you had an EMR champion within your practice, you'd had it. because you're basically dealing with the templates, and it's up to you to remember to update those templates. Well, what Scott is describing now is templates 2.0, where all of a sudden the idea that we can now code by time in the outpatient E&M setting is taken to ridiculous extremes of, well, if the time includes X, Y, and Z, and T, and U, and V, and W, we'll just include a laundry list of all of those things and say it included da 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 da, and we're done. And here's your total time, and give me my money. And in the same way as you were speaking about, Scott, where we had to have some type of narrative about what was discussed with the patient in 2020, I'm looking for that same type of narrative of the work that has been performed by that provider who's claiming that time. There are some EMR vendors that I'm working with on an audit. If I'm doing the audits and I'm working with, say, an EMR vendor on certain audits for their clients. I have one such EMR vendor that I'm working with now in the pediatric space. What each practice is bringing forward is something along the lines of, okay, well, we're using this, we're not using this. This is where I want to put some free-form text in about what exactly happened during this encounter, because free-form text is incredibly important in the new paradigm. It's going to take a lot of work. Some of these 2021 changes were kind of a sick practical joke on electronic medical record companies who have gotten very comfortable with the way things have been for 25 years, and suddenly they need to uproot it. And the time to start that uprooting was 2 years ago. It's not right now.
Well, and the last point I'd add to that is what's interesting to me is I'm not even suggesting time can't be expressed in a macro statement. I would suggest you probably can't have one macro statement that you just plug in every single time, because if these notes are fresh in my mind because I was looking at them an hour ago, and if this provider had just said, I spent 30 minutes because we had an extensive discussion about the condition, I see that throughout the note, right? But the problem is now you're telling me you spent time on things that you didn't do because of this macro, and so
Right.
I'm just throwing the whole macro out because I'm like it's not accurate.
And I think one of the things that's really important, and Stephanie, I want to get to you, to get your take on this as well. I think one of the points that needs to be made is when an audit is being performed internally, or you're utilizing an external vendor, you want to make certain that you're emulating what is actually being done from a payer's perspective. You want to look at these claims in the same tight-roped manner that a payer is going to look at these. And, if you're just looking at it with blinders on and you're like, oh, I understand what the doctor's saying. Well, you have to take the blinders off, and you have to be able to say, if I were an objective outside entity looking at this documentation, trying to find fault so that I could demand a recoupment, what would stick out to me as an auditor that I would say, gotcha? Stephanie, talk a little bit about some of the audits that you're actually engaged with and what you're seeing as well.
So there's two main issues I'm seeing. I have seen what Scott's talking about as well, but recently what I've been dealing with is the lack of medical necessity. So, as we're auditing, we don't have an audit tool to check things off that say, okay, yes, this is medically necessary because of these reasons. But we can see within the documentation whether or not the provider's really showing us their thought process, what took place during the encounter, what's happening that day. One thing that I saw last week is that the provider was using a lot of generic language, which again, to some extent, the new guidelines are supposed to help with that administrative time, but not completely take away what we're able to see within that note. So, we have generic language, patients there for follow-up of a chronic condition. I think it was more than one, so we'll say at least two. But the history portion of the note is saying the patient's fine, there's no problems, no issues with the current medications they're on. The assessment and plan show the same exact thing from the provider. No issues. Let's go ahead and continue the same medications at the same dose. But then all of a sudden there was a time statement with 60 minutes that was referencing counseling and education. So what did you need to counsel and educate about if the patient was fine this day and you're continuing what you did before? So, that could be a lack of documentation. Typically it is. Typically something did occur and they just did not put it in the note. But there's contradictions there. We can't see why it was necessary. The other issue I'm having right now is time when there's other services on the same day. So if we think about it, we have to carve out anything that's separately billable. So if we have injections, x-rays, even labs, it may be the lab equipment that's spitting out the results, but if you're reviewing those, it's a part of your medical decision making. We still have to separate out because there's separate charges for that. So what I'm finding is that the macro statement's not being changed when there is other services. And it'll say, I spent 80 minutes with the patient today. Well, I can't assume that injection took 10 minutes. Or, the other thing that I know probably really frustrates the providers that I'm working with, I can't even take an estimated guess as to how long it took to document that. So when the macro statement you're using states that I spent 80 minutes and that includes clinical documentation, you have another service. You have an interpretation from an x-ray. Was it 10 minutes? Was it 15 minutes? Was it 2 minutes? I can't make that determination, and it ends up really crumbling the entire time statement. And the issue with that, when it does take down the time statement, is that medical decision making does not support the 5 when time would. So the documentation needs to very clearly state, like Scott's saying, what took place that day and carving out anything else that was separately billable.
I agree, and I get a little concerned as well in the aggregate on the lack of precision in the time as it is documented. And I do think, Sean had introduced this as, what are the payers going to pick at, right? And so, it's not unusual for me to do a 20 chart audit where the provider has included a time statement on almost all of these charts. And the time statement is a uniform 30 minutes. It's never 35, it's never 33, it's always 30. And, I'm a little skeptical.
Or the same as the CPT description, right?
Right.
The minimum requirement. Yeah.
Right. And I'm a little skeptical that it's, frankly, it's a more accurate reflection, even though it's more vague, to say I spent at least 30 minutes, because at least you're opening the door to saying, well, I know I went over 30. But it's those types of things, right? Where we've talked about cloning in different formats, right? And it's essentially a cloned attestation that, to me, if I were the provider, or if I were the insurance company, I would say, well, so wait a minute, it was always exactly 30 minutes across the entire day. So you saw 20 patients today, that was 10 hours exactly. And it's the new guidelines make it a little opaque, right? Because I can say, well, I at the end of the day, I spent 4 hours in the EMR and I parsed that time out for each patient. But at the end of the day, the odds, we're talking lottery ticket level odds that it would always pencil out to exactly 30 minutes. And it's a pet peeve of mine, but it's something that gets, if I were the payer, I would pick at that from the setting of, this is a rock, a not a solid foundation of documentation, because I just don't believe it.
And let's remember that based on the Harvard-Ruck time study that goes on with some of these CPT codes and the E&M services, if you're reporting 5,000 or more hours in a year, that's something that you want to keep in the back of your mind. Most times when we're dealing in the clinical setting, it's because they're using extenders and they're billing under the physician's number. But if you're, as Scott said, if you're doing 30 minutes for every visit and suddenly you have 20 visits that day, well, suddenly that's quite a bit of clinical time, and it begins to spill over into the unbelievable or the it stretches credibility a little bit if performed day after day after day in a clinical setting, and it's going to add up. And it's, I would think in the new paradigm, the providers who are using time to bill are painting targets on their chest more so than the providers who are trying to put a good story forward as far as medical necessity and the acuity of that patient at the time of the encounter.
So I agree with you all. And, I think, the problem beyond what we're talking about also goes to the fact that, we're still dealing with volume-based care, right? Because we're still stuck with stagnant and, in a lot of cases, decreasing reimbursement. And, we could talk as much as we want about a transition to value-based care and how important it's going to be and how critical it is to make this transition and all the wonderful things that are going to come from it. But the cold hard fact is what? It's still going to require patients at a volume to be seen in order for physicians to be able to cover the costs associated with rendering care. That's what it comes down to. And there were some interesting conversations about, on the podcast the other day with Eric Rubenstein and Jordan Johnson, where we were looking at the fact that the United States ranks #1 in the highest costs of rendering medical services amongst all first world countries. But we ranked number 8 among all first world countries in where we stand with the quality of our care. It's mind-boggling to me. And, Eric brought up a little bit about, national health services and socialized medicine and this and that. Again, there's lots of debates and lots of conversations to have, but I think, providers need to really buckle down and pay attention to not what they're putting into their medical record, but what they're not putting into their medical record.
Yeah. Here's another quick thought. If you're billing by time, it is hoped that your risk scores are through the roof for risk adjustment.
Yes, great point.
If you're saying that everything is moderate or complex or, it's of high, if you're equating the time that you're reporting with a high level of medical decision-making and your Medicare Advantage carrier comes back and says, well, why is your risk score so low when you're spending hours and hours and hours with your patients and your diagnostic reporting is just not matching up to the high level of care that you're claiming based on your CPT reporting. And to me, that's like shooting fish in a barrel. If you've got a lot of ICD-10 codes that are ending in the number 9, but a lot of E&M codes that are ending in the number 5, you've got yourself a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or a limited number of diagnoses that are nondescript, non-specific, or don't paint a picture of high acuity or high risk. Scott, go ahead. I didn't mean to step on you.
Oh, no, you're fine. Here's another thing I've thought about. As a non-clinical auditor, I will always say, I don't really get into the business of what the physician decides to examine, right? I don't really feel like I'm going to walk in and have that conversation. That said, one of the things that can be counted in your time statements now is the time you spend on documentation, at least per the AMA, right? So if you're stating that you spent 40 minutes or whatever, you're at a level 5 number. And let's say the patient comes in and they have like a sprained ankle or something, I don't know. And your template is such that you're baking in these full system reviews, these full exams. What's to stop the payer from coming in and saying, well, you're saying you spent this time including documentation, but your documentation is full of extraneous things that had no relevance to the case. Now, of course, the provider at that point, that's the bear trap, right? Because the provider has just pulled all that from some previous note. And to me, those are things that I think about, right? Where it's I think the payer has opened the door in those time statements to come in and pick at all those little things and say, well, do I consider this medically necessary based on why the patient came in today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, Stephanie, anything further on the evaluation and management services and the medical decision-making and time before we tackle our next topic?
I was just going to say really quick, Scott's statement there reminded me I believe it was the first or second quarter of this year, earlier on, I was working with a cardiovascular group, and all of the providers did time, and of course they all billed fives across the board. So to me, that was a very high risk audit, because there's no way, it was the same thing too, where a lot of the patients did appear to be doing okay, and they weren't making new treatment new treatment decisions. So it was very, very questionable. And I didn't allow time.
I had a family provider who was billing all fives and tacking on 2 99417s, like throwing in 2 units of prolonged service.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Save that money to defend yourself.
Yeah. I'm picturing Keith Moon in his Target shirt as he plays the drums.
I was like, are you familiar? Have you considered a practice in concierge medicine?
Yeah. Well, there's something that's actually emerging, and it's called direct primary care. I don't know how much you all have had exposure to it, but it's actually really interesting. And it was something that I had looked at a while ago. It's called, again, direct primary care. And I don't know how much it's really going to catch on, because it's a form of concierge medicine. But what it basically says is that the decisions for the type of care that is best suited for a patient should be determined by a physician. And a physician's compensation should not be determined based on an arcane assignment of a group of numbers, right? 99213, 214, 215, that have work relative values attached to it, practice values, malpractice. So it's a variant from, there's that term again, variant. It's a variant from concierge medicine, but it is another concept that is out there, and I'm seeing in affluent areas around the country where physicians are actually starting to take a look at this. And there's, believe it or not, there's an HR bill and there's a Senate bill that are both being considered for direct primary care services. So kind of an interesting, turn of events, could fall in line with, what the government is considering, with trying to do with a single payer system, but, we'll see. Okay. So the other day I had an individual who sent me an email and said, "Hey, I was in one of your courses, at the beginning of the pandemic last year, and you were talking about Incident 2, one of my least favorite things to have to try to defend in court." And Scott, I know you, as well as Paul and Stephanie, we have had a lot of Incident 2 cases. Stephanie, you worked with me on the Jeffrey Campbell case out of Kentucky and Indiana. But this was kind of an interesting one, and I want to get your take on this. And I'll open it to all three of you. So basically, what was happening is this practice was employing nurse practitioners. And the nurse practitioners, although they were new to the practice and they had filed for their credentialing with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they were still rendering Incident 2 services under the direction of a physician, so direct supervision. And those services were in turn being billed under the physician. Well, that's a big no-no. Because in order, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, because I did some verifying. And here's one of the things that I was able to find. So for those of you that are struggling with Incident 2 services, let me again share with you the importance of getting this stuff right, because if you don't, it's going to lead to a lot of potential problems. So here's what the actual guideline says. And this comes from Noridian, and it specifically says, since NPs, CNSs, and PAs can enroll with Medicare Part B to receive their own PTAN, services provided by these specialists would only be considered Incident 2 if all prior above conditions are met. So again, I love it. Medicare compliance one. I think I know who that is.
That person is my spirit animal, because that's just say no. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
best.
Yes. Just say
Well-
no.
Well, doesn't this remind us all about why Medicare eliminated consultations? You explain it and you explain it and you explain it, and you still have on the MAC level 40% error rates for consultation services, to the point where the carrier just says, you know what, we're done with this. You know, no more consultation payments. It's either new or an established visit on the office setting or initial hospital care in the hospital setting. We're done.
That's right.
And incident 2 is the same thing. And one of the biggest things that we're coming up against is the fact that there's still some commercial payers out there who refuse to credential non-physician practitioners.
Yeah.
You know, so in a setting like that, I mean, it's
and to your point, they're not only not credentialing them, they're actually silent on whether or not they can function incident to a physician. Scott and I have a federal case right now that is it's still a civil matter. We're hoping that it doesn't turn criminal, and it's all tied to what? Incident to services with non-credentialed individuals at the commercial payer level. But let me just finish the thought on this, okay? Because I agree with my very good friend Medicare Compliance One. Say no. Incident to services are not worth the extra amount of money that you get paid, which equates to putting cheese on a quarter pounder at McDonald's. It's just not worth it, because the documentation is never what it's supposed to be. There's so much gray matter that that exists between the physician has to engage at a reasonable interval. Well, what does that even mean? Is that every third visit, every fifth visit? Is it once a year? Is it biannually? I mean, this is a problem. Get it. But to my point on this one, for this specific issue, you cannot bill for services rendered by a provider to Medicare until their credentialing is approved, which is why they allow you to retroactive bill 30 days. So, folks, stay away from these incident to services. I swear to God, I feel like I preach this again and again and again. I feel like I'm a pastor or a rabbi or a priest or a shaman or whatever, giving the same message every single week to my congregation. No.
I think you mean a shaman. Like a shaman is a whole
Shaman's
other...
the toilet paper, isn't it? A shaman.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm from Georgia, so we get to say a lot of the things that in our own way. So, to Robert's point, hang on real quick. Yeah. To Robert's point, BCBS of Texas doesn't even recognize incident 2. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a huge point.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I was going to say is that if you can't make incident 2 work because of credentialing issues, as you just mentioned, stop trying to ask me about whether you can use locum tenens in the interim, and try to stop figuring out a workaround. The workaround is get your non-physician practitioners credentialed before they even see a patient.
That's right.
Stop trying to fix it backward.
Right.
And I'm tired of those questions.
Yeah. I mean, listen, it's hard. It's hard to get them again and again and again, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to ask your questions, even if we've addressed them 100 times, because we'd rather give you the right answers than for you to run the risk of billing it the wrong way and then getting tagged. Now, is that good for consultants and lawyers out there because you need their help down the road? Sure it is, but just stay away from the incident to services. And our person at CMS actually said we should expect by the end of the year another revision to the incident to billing provision guidelines for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So we will see. Now, I want to jump to a huge issue. And even though this is tied to a subspecialty, I could see this happening in other specialties where off-labeled use of a drug that is being administered for infusions is now being looked at as a possible treatment option for COVID-19 and one of the variants. Stephanie, rheumatology is the big topic right now, right? Because that's where we're seeing, and I'm going to let you tell us the name of the drug because I almost called it ivermectin, and it's not ivermectin.
No, it's Actemra.
Actemra. They all sound the same. Come on, drug companies, get creative, find different names.
Yet another focus group drug. There we
Another focus group drug. There you go. So let's talk about this drug for just a moment, okay? And talk about what it is that you're actually seeing in the rheumatology space right now, please.
Right. So with Actemra, there recently, and I don't know when, I believe it was in the last month or so, FDA basically approved Actemra as an emergency, what would you call it? Emergency approval, I guess?
Yeah.
For treating COVID.
A breakthrough drug for COVID.
Yeah. So what's happening now is that infusion drug that's typically used for RA patients for rheumatoid arthritis is now being used to treat COVID. And there's a shortage. So we have patients in the rheumatology field who may have been on this for years. It's their regular treatment. And one of the things that we've heard is pretty much the practices when they're ordering this drug, there is no rhyme or reason, and they don't have a way to know ahead of time how much of this drug they're getting and in what way. So it's my understanding, I'm not clinical, but it's my understanding that it can come in 3 different size vials. So when they get that, they may have one that has 400 milligrams versus, we'll just say 200 or 300 as an example. So the problem then becomes when they're calculating the doses for their patient at time of infusion, there's waste. So what do you do with the waste? Do you bill it out and get paid for it, knowing that this is taking away from other patients that you have coming in who also need the same drug? So what this one particular client's trying to work through right now is a solution to make the drug go as far as it can go, but still remain compliant from the documentation and coding perspective.
Right. So basically what we're saying is if you're going to use a multi-dose vial for patients, okay, for more than one patient, your waste has to be 0 on each of those patients in order for you to be legitimately reimbursed by an insurance company for the milligrams or the milliliters or micrograms or however it's calculated for these infusions, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things, with COVID, we've kind of dealt with this since the beginning, where until they put out new guidance, we have to look at what's available and make determinations based on what's available. So when you look at CMS's guidance regarding drug wastage, what they're doing is they're wanting to make sure that you're not reporting it for waste on one person and then using it on another and being paid twice for that same amount. Now, for what we have available to us now, the best option seems to be what Sean is explaining there. You just want to make sure that you're not reporting it as waste so that you also get reimbursed as waste and then use it on the next. But I have a feeling that, this is going to be an issue for a while because we didn't get updates quickly previously with everything we went through in the beginning of the pandemic. So I don't think we necessarily will here either.
Yeah. I'm hoping everybody can see that. Are you able to see what I just put up on the screen? So I just figured out how to do something new on our podcast platform. I clicked the button and I was like, uh-oh, what's going to happen? As Medicare Compliance 1 put up, to quote the FDA, under today's EUA, the FDA is authorizing the emergency use of Actemra for the treatment of certain hospitalized patients with COVID-19. But, and here's the rest of it, Actemra is not approved as a treatment for COVID-19. I mean, look, and I'm not, what? Honestly, if somebody gets pissed off at me, okay, you know what? Fine.
Here we go.
But here's the reason why here's the reason why you still have 80 million to 100 million people that don't want to get a vaccine. Here's the reason why you have so many people that are scratching their heads saying, explain to me. I had COVID-19 in January or February of this year. I'm supposed to have the antibodies in my system, which you told me I would have at the conclusion of the COVID-19. I've now contracted COVID-19 again. You can't tell me which variant is it. Is it now? You can figure out the variant if somebody's in the hospital and there's a specific drug test that could actually be performed. Then we have all these drugs that are coming out, right? Ivermectin. I'm not a clinician, but in the very beginning, I started looking at COVID-19 and I also sat on a governor's task force, right? So I was privy to a lot of information that maybe some weren't. And I did my best to disseminate that and to put it out without getting kicked off that panel. But, I took ivermectin. When I got COVID, when I first got diagnosed, I did the research and I recognized that COVID actually begins as a parasite before it morphs into a virus. And I actually went to my physician and I said, look, I understand it's experimental, but what do you think about trying ivermectin? And I was fortunate enough to have a provider that was like, Sean, I don't really know what this is going to do, but let's dose it correctly so that we don't harm you. And I don't give you enough that it's meant for a horse. And let's see what happens with this thing. And they put me on the ivermectin and they put me on the quercetin, the biotin, the vitamin C, the vitamin D, the stuff to help you sleep at night, the melatonin. And let me tell you something. I had it for 16 days, right? The COVID, I think you guys remember, I was down for, 16 days. But I'll tell you, by the third or fourth day after I had taken the medication, my symptoms and signs were all now starting to come down. I was starting to feel better. I don't know if it was from the ivermectin, but there's so much bad information out there, right? Because on one hand, you have people saying, you can't take ivermectin. It'll kill you. It's not right. And then you have another group of people who are saying, from a clinical perspective, wait a minute, there is some value to the ivermectin. It's the same thing with this Actemra. It's approved for an emergency use, but it's not approved for COVID-19. I don't get it. I'm struggling. And, if somebody out there wants to, be ugly with me, go ahead. It's Friday.
My only comment. I'm not going to be ugly with you. As someone who likes free stuff, something I got from my dad, when they said you can show up at your doctor and get this free vaccine, I was like, well, it's free. So I went and I got it. I got it twice and I was fine. The only advice I would give to people as far as anything that's related to COVID is I feel like you should talk about it with your own physician, not somebody you met online. And if you don't trust what your physician tells you, find one you do trust. Not somebody online. That concludes
and I'm not telling anybody to listen to me at all on the ivermectin or any of the vitamins or Actemra or any of this stuff. What I'm saying is, to your point, stop listening to the politicians. Stop listening to Joe Rogan, who by the way, I love, but I would never take my medical advice from Joe Rogan. Okay. There's a lot of advice I would not take from Joe Rogan.
Now look,
speak to your healthcare provider who understands this stuff and make the right decision between you and your doctor.
Now, if I were in the hospital with COVID, I would be like, hey, roll the whole buffet tray in here. Give me everything you got, right? I don't care what it is, right?
I'll also add this with regard to pharmaceuticals. We don't even know whether there is a drug that is put forward right now or a long-standing drug that is any type of curative for this particular virus. And I know this is like the extreme example, but I remember that the drug thalidomide, which was given to women when they were pregnant in the early 60s and led to horrifying birth defects, 30 years later came back as a breast cancer drug. So you know, I'm not a shill for the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, you know, the pharmaceutical industry in a token will get you a nice subway ride in most cases,
Right.
but we don't even, you know, there are things that may be able to be repurposed, but the only way to really truly do that is not through the lens of speakers corners type hysteria of social media or televised news, but from actual science and actual medical providers who are on the front lines of the pandemic.
And I think that's a great point. And here's the final thing. You know, I'm a research fanatic. Okay. That's all I do as a compliance and regulatory and health law professional. That's all I do is I read. There was a fascinating post by an infectious disease doctor on LinkedIn yesterday, taking care of a 12-year-old or 14-year-old child who was not vaccinated, but contracted the COVID-19, and while in the hospital was placed onto massive doses of steroids. And as a result, it has now led to a deterioration in the knees of the patient, and it is now showing osteoarthritic changes to where it's now bone on bone, and this young individual is facing a knee replacement. Now, there were a lot of comments about this, and again, you know, I'm not a doctor, but you know, I think to your point, Paul, it's important for people to, you know, follow the science and to avoid CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, any of these that are trying to lean one way or the other, and do the right thing. Speak to your personal healthcare professional and get the guidance that's best suited for you and your medical condition. For me, I got the vaccine. I've got heart disease. I'm borderline diabetic. You know, I've got all kinds of other things going on. You know, it seemed like, yeah, I got my COVID card too. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I do believe people have to make the right decision for themselves with their healthcare provider. Okay, we swayed way off track. I want to pull us back onto the coding, billing, and auditing for just a moment, because Stephanie, there was one more aspect of this Actemra that I thought was problematic. And there was a practice that was actually looking to do what?
I went to unmute and there was a chat box in my way. So yeah, the other side of that is some were looking to underdose. Now, one of the issues I see from the coding and billing side, it's funny because I just got asked this about Actemra this week, but last week I was dealing with a different rheumatology practice, and I don't know the clinical side, but the physician had understood the particular drug they were working with to allow him to round down on his dosing. And what had happened is they were getting multiple appeals for this one particular drug, because if you look at the order and it's based on, you know, the dose and calculated by the patient's weight that day, it equaled 678 milligrams. But then when you look at the records, they just gave 600. So the payer was denying not only that one claim in its entirety, they didn't want to pay for it at all. They did with every patient he did that for. So the problem becomes, you know, if you're going to underdose, again, if I'm auditing from the documentation side and the coding side, I'm looking to see what you're telling me was your total dose that day, what was given, what was wasted. But you have to remember on the payer side, there's also clinical staff there. They're going in doing the calculations in the same way that your physicians or nurses are doing right before that session. So that's something to think about. I think that's going to be the more riskier option if people go that way. It's going to be hard to defend after.
Great point. All right. So today we had a great conversation with our panel, Stephanie Howard, Paul Spencer, Scott Kraft. I want to say thank you to each and every single one of you for joining me on the Compliance Guide today. To our folks that were following us on LinkedIn, on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining in. My name is Sean Weiss, and be good to yourself, but more importantly, be good to each other. And I promise I will try to do better next time. On our shows coming up next week, we have super lawyer Ronald Chapman II. He and I will be breaking down the Merrick Garland memo as well as the executive order by Biden. I have Ashley Morgan coming up from Lyles Parker on the show and a whole host of other folks. But I do want to let you know we are going to try to put together a coding auditing roundtable at least once a month to bring this to all of you, our viewers. Please submit feedback to us on scenarios, coding situations, auditing conundrums that you are running into, and we will try to address those for you. From myself and on behalf of our special guest panel today, thank you all so much for joining in. Have a blessed weekend, and we'll see you next week on The Compliance Guy.